Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be talking about the top 5 worst changes from 9th edition to 10th edition Warhammer 40k. So I just recently did a video talking about the best changes. I've really liked 10th edition so far in general, but there has been some real stinker changes, I think, that we need to address. And hopefully GW can kind of work towards fixing. I know they've been pretty serious about fixing a lot of the balance changes and stuff, but I would also like to see them be serious about changing the things that don't really work well in 10th edition, and although they may have been well-intentioned, aren't really working as intended. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into it. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be exactly looking at in today's video. We're going to be talking about the things GW fixed since 10th edition's release that were easily some of the worst aspects of the game. We're going to kind of talk about the elephant in the room and address those right off the bat. And then we're going to get into the 5 worst changes from 9th edition to 10th edition. So talking about the major things GW fixed since 10th edition's release that were easily some of the worst aspects of the game, just to get those things briefly out of the way and address them, are as follows: towering, devastating wounds, indirect fire, the vast faction imbalance that existed on release, and other miscellaneous fixes and errors. So, as most of you guys will know, towering basically in the beginning of the edition allowed units to ignore obscuring terrain for line of sight purposes. So, towering units like Knights, Chaos Knights, Eldar Wraith Knights, things like that, could just basically fire over everything on the board if they could physically see it, and absolutely destroy armies before they even had the chance to strike. This was one of the most OP and absolutely devastating parts of the game. You had armies like Imperial Knights wiping out half of the board on their first turn. You had armies like Eldar being able to spam Wraith Knights and essentially do the same thing, but even more efficiently, because of the fact that they had devastating wounds as well, which was another broken aspect of early 10th edition, because devastating wounds caused mortal wounds, and how mortal wounds was applied was one at a time. So all the half effects, like the half damage effects, like from the Avatar of Cain and the Yinkarn and other models like that, basically wouldn't be activated. So it was a great way around a lot of different kinds of damage mitigation rules. Indirect fire was also really overpowered because all the indirect fire units at the beginning of the edition were way too cheap, and people were just spamming them if they had them. So you had Imperial Guard artillery armies, which, Imperial Guard wasn't the most OP army out there by any stretch of the imagination upon release, but that artillery army was very nasty, especially if you weren't using the other OP things in the beginning of the edition. Eldar, of course, had a lot of great indirect fire as well, via the support weapons and the Night Spinner, which, Night Spinner's still really powerful. And, you had Desolators and things like that from Space Marine armies that were just wiping people off the board before they even had the chance to strike. Those units have since been costed appropriately. They've received several nerfs. Indirect fire received a nerf as well. You cannot overwatch and indirect fire at the same time anymore. So, no more overwatching out of line of sight and so forth. Now, for the vast faction imbalance, a lot of factions in the beginning of 10th edition were either really powerful or, by comparison, complete trash. A lot of that actually has been ironed out. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, that, that's not true and that the game is still very imbalanced and things like that, and you have factions like Eldar that are ahead of the pack. But compared to what it was, and kind of even comparing it to last edition, at least before the Arcs of Omen changes that they made, late 9th, 10th edition is actually looking pretty balanced, especially when you consider the state of game in 9th edition before Arcs of Omen, when you had armies like Dark Angels who were also winning 57 to 58% of tournament games. And even at that time, people were really happy with the balance before the Arcs of Omen changes occurred. So, despite having Dark Angels at like 57, 58% win rate, there were a lot of people who were generally happy with the balance in 40k. And I pretty much think we've reached the same position now, except that, instead of Dark Angels, it's the Eldari, right? It's the Eldar. And I think some of that is due to the fact that a lot of you guys out there, maybe not Eldar players, but a lot of you guys out there listening to this, don't really care for the Eldar as a faction. And that's definitely okay and everything, but it doesn't exactly mean that the Eldar are super OP right now or anything like that. It just means they're a little bit above where they should be, and they'll probably get nerfed back down in January. Ever so slightly, of course. Now, the last thing is miscellaneous fixes and errors, which every single edition has. So yes, did 10th edition have a lot of errors in the beginning, and was it super funny that GW kind of seemed like it rushed through a lot of the data sheets and stuff like that and made so many typos? Yes, it's funny. But those have been fixed, so, it was a rush job, obviously. They didn't put a lot of time into the editing and so forth. But now that things have calmed down a little bit, we've seen, probably about 99% of these things fixed. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the actual worst changes from 9th edition to 10th edition that have not been addressed and that are still probably going to be here for the rest of 10th edition until they decide to, of course, write another rulebook and make us spend a lot more money to continue our hobby. So the first thing is the change to psychic powers. Second is free war gear and fixed unit sizes. The third is nerfs to melee combat. Then, of course, we have the massive change to Overwatch. And lastly, the changes to the fly keyword and how it works on the tabletop. So let's go ahead and start off with the change that I think affects the Eldar the most, and that is the change to psychic powers. Now, psychic powers either usually happen in the command phase, basically just an ability that happens in the command phase that you roll a 2+ on to go off, or it's just another ranged weapon. So all Witchfire powers just became ranged weapons, and buffing abilities or debuffs are things that you activate in either the shooting phase or command phase. On top of this, psychic powers are also locked to specific units on the datasheet. So, Farseer on foot has Fortune, Farseer on bike has Guide, and you cannot switch those around. If you want Guide, you need to take the Jet Seer. If you want Fortune, you need to take the Foot Seer. And that goes for pretty much every single faction in the game. If you want certain powers, you need to take that specific datasheet. Now, even though psychic powers did become far more simple because of this, they also did become a lot more boring. And I think that's a shame, because as an Eldar player, I really loved the psychic phase. I thought there was a lot of interaction in the psychic phase between a lot of different armies. Yes, not every army had psychic powers, but this was balanced out by other things. The Tau, for example, didn't have psychic powers, but they had a lot of buffs that they could also cast on their troops. Ethereals and Fireblades and stuff gave buffs to friendly units, not in a similar way to psychic powers, but something that was, an alternative way to give your units buffs or debuff enemies. So I really found GW's reasoning for taking away the psychic phase a little bit just not really correct. Their reasoning was they didn't want players to just sit through an entire phase and not be able to do anything, but that's pretty much what players have to do every turn anyway. Think about it. When it's not your turn, what are you generally doing? You are sitting there and waiting for your opponent to do stuff, and occasionally you might be able to use a stratagem or, ability or something like that, but for the most part, you're sitting there reacting to your opponent, and during your own turn, when you're casting your buffs and stuff like that, they're doing the same exact thing likewise. It may be in a different phase, but it's essentially the same idea. So I never really got their reasoning, behind so sad, the poor Tau player who doesn't get a psychic phase. Or the poor Dark Eldar player who, just can't cast psychic powers. They have nothing to cast psychic powers. Oh, how sad for that player. I never understood that, because they get other stuff that the Eldar or the Thousand Suns or whatever other army that can cast psychic powers doesn't have access to. And also, in some cases, it was actually a bit of a drawback for armies that could cast psychic powers, because there was a good chance you would fail the psychic power in a lot of cases, unless you're, of course, a very psychically attuned faction like the Eldar or Thousand Suns. And those other armies who didn't have psychic powers often had things to stop psychic powers in some way, shape, or form. Now, there is a counter argument to this that I do understand, and that is that the psychic phase was just simply too complex. Not only was it complex in the list building phase of the game, but it was also complex in the way that you had so many different psychic powers, and the psychic powers that you did use, were used in a lot of different ways. And a lot of people out there, including Eldar players, who kind of support this change that they got rid of the psychic phase, just point out that, well, psychic powers are easier now. It's not as big of a concern, and also there was really only a few psychic powers you were ever going to use anyway, even though we had like 15 or 16 of them. Right? So even though we had a lot of options when it came to psychic powers, only about 4 of those were actually viable in-game, which is a good argument, right? Now, I do agree. I think that the bloat in psychic powers was a little bit much, but I would have at least liked to keep the psychic phase so that I could feel like, a psychic faction like the Eldar could really lean into that and enjoy it. It didn't have to be exactly the same as it was in 9th edition, but I would have appreciated some more, thought and care put into using psychic powers in 10th. So the next change we're going to talk about is the free war gear and fixed unit sizes that GW introduced in 10th edition. So as of 10th edition, weapons, war gear, and upgrades are all free now. They're free with the datasheet. You can take whatever you want and not have to pay any points for it. Squad sizes are also fixed. They're no longer adjustable on a model-to-model basis. So you either take 5 or you take 10, and anything in between is going to just count for the next biggest unit size. Which basically means if you have 6 striking scorpions, for example, you're going to be paying for the full 10. So you always want to either go with 5 or with 10, and oftentimes, at least with Eldar, you're just going to go with 5. Now, what this means is, as far as the, free war gear and things like that higher value weapon and war gear options are 9 times out of 10 going to be the auto take, which skews the units into a higher point bracket than they may otherwise belong. So if any of you guys are wondering why some of your units are so expensive, it's because of the most expensive options available to those units. Those almost 200 point Leman Russ battle tanks, the reason why they're that expensive is because they're assuming you are going to take all of the most expensive sponsons and hull weapon choices, as well as all those extra upgrades, those hunter-killer missiles, those heavy stubbers, the shuriken cannons, etc. And this kind of has changed the role of some units. Some units you don't want to actually equip with the cheaper weapon options because you're still going to be paying the higher, more expensive weapon options points cost, right? So things like a Viper, for example, you're never going to want to give a Viper a scatter laser because, well, the scatter laser is meant for light infantry, and light infantry duty is typically for cheaper units. So that is a pretty big issue this edition, right? Is that some of the data sheets that you use, they have all the options available to them, but really you're just going to always want to pick the best options for that datasheet no matter what. Fixed unit sizes also means there's a lot less room for damage tailoring. So, if you're taking a squad of Howling Banshees, it's kind of hard to get just the right amount of Howling Banshees in your unit to be able to do the job that they need to do, especially with combat being so weak now. But there is a good counter argument that actually has some merit, arguing why free war gear and fixed unit sizes are actually, kind of good. And that is that, yes, there may be some imbalances between datasheets now as far as their weapon options go, but this gives GW the room later to add new datasheets with the same unit with a different weapon upgrade and give it different rules and things like that. So this kind of gives new life to units that, were played the same way for years and years and years. It gives them the option of being played differently. So a Viper with a Bright Lance might have a different special rule than a Viper with a scatter laser, and therefore they may be 2 different data sheets. And I actually think that if GW does do this in the future, it would be a really good move and a reason why this system would actually be a benefit instead of a drawback. However, I still think the fixed unit sizes, although simple, is a bit of a shame for veterans of the game who like to calculate the damage on their units more specifically for competitive play. All right, so we touched on this a little bit, but I did want to touch on it a little bit more in depth, and that is the nerfs to melee combat. So a lot of people really dislike this, especially melee armies, in the beginning of 10th edition. Not only did melee datasheets get nerfed pretty much across the board in all armies, but consolidation is also much weaker as you need to engage enemies or get onto objectives to use it. You can't just always use it, and therefore you're getting a little bit less movement on your models each and every time you win a combat and consolidate. Which means that full melee armies just got a lot slower. Also, the way models engage is considerably weaker as well. As per the rules in 10th edition, you must move as close to enemy models as possible in pile-in and also in charges, meaning there's pretty much no extra movement that you can squeeze out of it. So you can't try to wrap around the enemy unit because you really won't have room to do it if you can't make base contact with enemy models. Reactionary moves and Overwatch are also everywhere this edition. Reactionary moves being, a reaction to getting close to enemy units. So if you have a unit that gets close to you, you can just move 6 inches back, just like Rangers and just like, Phobos units, Phobos infiltrators and stuff like that, right? So there's really just a lot of ways in this edition to kick melee in the teeth. And unfortunately, GW decided that melee was too strong in 9th for whatever reason and decided to essentially, for the most part, kill it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that melee is impossible or that there are not strong melee units in the game, because that is not true, and melee does hold a very important part of the game still. But, it's definitely not as strong as it once was in 9th. And of course, melee wouldn't be nearly as weak as it is in 10th edition if it wasn't for the improved Overwatch. So Overwatch can now be used in the movement and charge phase, in addition to having a 24-inch range. So that's a huge boost from 9th edition, where Overwatch only had a 12-inch range and could only be used in the charge phase. And even then, there were a lot of units that could either deny Overwatch or mitigate it somehow. It can easily, as of now, shut down huge avenues of engagement, especially for expensive and fragile units. So as an Eldar player, I know this especially well. Overwatch is extremely deadly to units like Howling Banshees, Harlequins, Striking Scorpions, and things of that nature. And for Dark Eldar players, units like Witches have a lot more trouble getting into combat in the first place, and even when they do, of course, Witches and other combat units are generally a lot weaker as well. So this made combat even weaker than it was before, and there's not a whole lot of room for counterplay. Even though Overwatch did get nerfed, so yes, it did get nerfed, you can't Overwatch out of line of sight anymore, and Titanic units also cannot Overwatch, but it is still an extremely strong mechanic that holds back a lot of factions from unlocking their true deadly potential. And personally, I think Overwatch and the changes made to Overwatch in 10th edition are simply far too oppressive for a lot of factions to deal with. Lastly, we have the changes to the fly keyword. Now, a lot of you guys might actually not think of this too much, but I think about it all the time. Now, models with fly that don't have the infantry keyword as well cannot simply move through ruins and buildings as if they were not there. They have to move up and over them, measuring diagonally, which, if you've ever actually done that, it's a lot of extra movement to have to move around ruins, especially if they're multiple stories. Not only does this massively slow down non-infantry flying units, but it is really annoying to do properly with a tape measure. And again, you guys probably know this at least as well as I do. When you're moving wave serpents and falcons and vipers over ruins when you have to, and sometimes, you just have to do it, having to measure that tape measure diagonally from the bottom of the board to the top of the ruin is extremely annoying. And I know it's not part of gameplay itself, but it's definitely part of real life that we have to deal with, right? Which sucks. So really don't like the fly keyword changes in a lot of different ways. And models that have fly are still really expensive for having fly, right? You're paying those points for the fly special rule, even though it sucks on a lot of units that it's on, right? It's good on infantry, don't get me wrong, but when you put it on vehicles and monsters and things like that, it's just not that useful, and those things are still paying the points for that fly special rule, even though it really doesn't do anything for them. A good example of this is the Dark Eldar Raider. The Dark Eldar Raider costs 90 points. It's a pretty expensive vehicle, but it's basically paper thin. It dies to a stiff breeze. But then why is it 90 points and an orc truck is much less expensive? Well, just simply due to the fact that a raider has the fly special rule. So it pays extra points for having the privilege, quote unquote, of being able to move over ruins and other obstacles. But the sad truth is it often doesn't come into play and often doesn't matter. So, the changes to fly have not only been annoying to actually measure when it does come up, but it is also a detriment to the units that have it that are also not infantry models. Alright, so in conclusion, to me, these are the changes that I've disliked the most, and while I do understand the reasoning behind some of them, I think there was a better way to implement them. However, I have to say we're probably stuck with a lot of these changes. I'm hoping they do something to Overwatch. I'm hoping they do something to fix up fly a little bit, give a little bit more of an advantage to models that, have fly but also don't have the infantry keyword, but they probably won't do much to those things because they're just part of the intended rules that GW came out with in 10th edition. Now, of course, these are just my opinions. If you have different opinions about the worst changes in 40K, let me know in the comments section. I would love to hear your guys' complaints about the new edition. Let me have it and have at it. After all, salt is the seasoning that drives this game forward and makes it so colorful. So definitely leave your complaints about 10th edition in the comments. I'm looking forward to seeing those. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. We just hit 3K subscribers, which is awesome, and I hope to continue growing so that we can reach out and bring more of the community together. Thank you so much as well to all the people who have supported the Kickstarter. I really appreciate that. It's probably not going to actually succeed, but thank you for trying and helping support it anyway. And just to let you guys know, I am also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, which I am currently working on putting more apparel on. So if you want to check those things out as well, or maybe get some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, you can check out the links in the description. All right, everybody, that's going to be it today. Have some great games this weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.